The National Guard is meant to protect the United States of America, and the Minnesota National Guard is meant to protect the state of Minnesota. Not Iraq, not Afghanistan, not Syria, or any other damn place they decide they're going to fight this, quote, war on terror.
So Scott, if you would, please come up here, and I have no fear that you're going to live up to that introduction, by the way. So this is Scott Horton, and he is about to blow you clear back to the war monument back there. So, Scott, thank you.
Hey, Scott.
Hi guys, thank you everybody for coming out today, appreciate it. And I gotta say, I'm so impressed by every single speaker up here today. It's just been fantastic. So thank you all doing your part in this thing. All right, so 21 years ago tomorrow was the beginning of the war on terrorism. And if you remember back the image in your mind of the planes hitting the towers that morning, the planes came out of the clear blue sky, just like in the cliche. So even though, of course, the World Trade Center had been bombed years before, essentially with the new millennium and the new presidency and the images and the narrative from that day, the idea was that this is all brand new. History began that day, September 11th, 2001. Now we've been confronted with evil, and now we have to go and defend ourselves from evil. But that's just not the whole story. And I'll give you the very fast version, and you can do all the research you want. I did write a book about it or two. And you know what, the truth is, almost everybody, not just the people here, but pretty much everybody in American society who pays attention to politics and history and foreign policy at all, they know a lot of this story already. You probably know a lot of this story already. I hope to just kind of fill in a couple of puzzle pieces to help you see the cause and effect through, that's all. So Jimmy Carter had some policies. One of them was backing the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in order to provoke the Soviet Union into invading Afghanistan. The idea was, since the American people had Vietnam syndrome and didn't want to contain the Reds anymore, you know what, maybe we'll bait them into overexpansion instead. Now, we don't want them to move into West Germany, but how about Afghanistan? Those people are expendable. So they deliberately attempted to provoke the Soviet Union into invading, and in 1979, in Christmas '79, they did. Now, I don't really think it's true that the Soviets invaded directly in response to the American provocation, but that's still what they were going for, and it's what they were trying to accomplish, was to give the Soviets a headache at the very least. The other thing was, the same year that began, 1979, was the disastrous for America revolution in Iran. Now, when we all think back on the Iranian Revolution, we all picture the riot, and they're burning the flag, and they're taking the hostages. But that's blurring separate events together. The Iranian Revolution actually took place in February of 1979. And you guys might remember, some of you older people might remember seeing images of the Ayatollah getting on the plane in Paris, France, to go home to Iran to inherit the revolution. And you might have wondered, but ain't the French our friends? Why would they send him home to inherit the revolution if we didn't want them to? Of course, the answer is the Jimmy Carter administration did want them to. The State Department and CIA, they knew that the Shah was dying of cancer, that they had no one really to replace him, and that they had this popular revolution, and you guys won't be surprised. They knew the Ayatollah Khomeini. They had helped work with his group back in 1953 when he helped to create pressure to overthrow the Shah Mohammad Mossadegh, to reinstall the Shah Reza Pahlavi back in '53. So they said, we know this guy, we can work with him. And they did. And once the Ayatollah took power, Jimmy Carter's government continued to pass him intelligence about Soviet intentions and Iraqi intelligence that whole year long. It wasn't until November when David Rockefeller convinced Jimmy Carter to let the Shah into the United States for cancer treatment that the riots broke out and the students seized the embassy and the hostages, and that's what led to the terrible hostage crisis. which was, of course, a massive humiliation for Jimmy Carter. So then what'd he do? He announced the Carter Doctrine that said America owns the Persian Gulf. It's an American lake, and we will be the dominant force in the Middle East from now on. And that was a warning to the Soviets that they better not try to invade Iran and then dominate the Gulf. We would consider that an attack on the United States of America, Jimmy Carter said. And of course, as a major part of that Carter Doctrine was support, beginning in early 1980, in the aftermath of the hostage crisis in Iran, support for the new Iraqi dictator. He didn't seize power in a revolution. He seized power in a bloody coup d'etat, overthrowing his predecessor, and his invasion of Iran. Now, Saddam didn't just invade Iran because he was a mean guy and he likes invading things. He invaded Iran because he was the Sunni dictator sitting on a supermajority Shiite Arab country. And as soon as the Shiite revolution went off in Iran, he was afraid that the Shiite population in Iraq, or at least in large measure, would choose their religious sect over their national and ethnic sect as Iraqis and Arabs, and join with the Shiites in Iran next door and possibly overthrow him. So to preempt that danger, he conscripted them all and sent them to war with Iran with Jimmy Carter and the United States of America's support. Then Ronald Reagan comes in and he continues all of these policies, supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and supporting Saddam Hussein in his 8-year war, or 9-year war against Iran. Now, when you think about Afghanistan, you might picture Rambo 3 when Rocky went over there to save the day. But in that movie, in your mind's eye, those memories, you'll be picturing essentially only Afghan Mujahideen, local Pashtun types. But in fact, that war was fought in great measure by what was called the Arab-Afghan Army, where they recruited thousands of Arabs from around the Middle East to all go and travel to Afghanistan to fight against the communists. Some of these groups were the core of what later became Al-Qaeda. Now, after Ronald Reagan was gone, his vice president, George H.W. Bush Sr., became president. And a couple things changed. First of all, the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan and from existence. And the Soviet Union fell, and you know, it's funny because H.W. Bush actually tried to save the USSR at the end, which failed. But mostly, his demeanor during that whole event actually really helped to allow the Soviet Union to come down. As he put it, he could have tap danced on the Berlin Wall and he didn't rub it in their face. He was a good sport about the whole thing, and that really did help to see the end of the Soviet Union's existence. So that was the big victory in Afghanistan. And then, of course, the Iran-Iraq war just ended in a stalemate, essentially, in 1989. But then Saddam Hussein had some problems, especially major war debts to Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. And not only that, he had a real extra problem with Kuwait because they were overproducing from shared oil wells in the Rumelia oil fields on the border region there. At the time, oil was trading at about $10 a barrel. So they were, the Iraqis, no matter how much oil they sold, essentially they were just driving the price even lower and not making any money to rebuild their country whatsoever. And the Kuwaitis were adding insult to injury, deliberately so, with American encouragement. And so on July 25th, 1990, Saddam Hussein summoned the American ambassador, April Glaspie, and she told him, and this was always the Iraqi side of the story, but now we know it's true because of Julian Assange, who's now rotting at Joe Biden's behest in solitary confinement in prison in Great Britain for bringing us this truth, that April Glaspie, in fact, told Saddam Hussein that we're not interested in your border dispute with Kuwait. This is between you and them. And essentially gave him a flashing yellow light. So we're not interested in having a war in the Middle East. Well, he wasn't interested in having a war either. He was just going to walk right in there and take over the whole country in a coup de main, which is exactly what he did. Well, in fact, it was the specific instructions of Secretary of State James Baker to tell him to allow this to happen. West Texas rules. You overproduce from a shared oil well, you get your leg broke. That's how it works. But what happened was, Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, was the one, and their country was the one that had the massive investments in oil and had massive Kuwaiti investments in British government debt. So they were the ones who wanted the war. And Margaret Thatcher called Bush a wimp, essentially, which was already his reputation at the time, and said, now don't you go wobbly on me now, Bush, publicly. Essentially saying he had to be man enough to launch this war. And that was in August of 1990, and they spent the rest of 1990, half the year, refusing to negotiate in good faith with their former client from just a few weeks before, Saddam Hussein. And they refused to negotiate, and he was willing to negotiate on extremely reasonable terms. Once they decided to build up Desert Shield, they launched their war. Now everybody knows that Iraq War I was great. It's all our space-age technology against their rusted old Soviet stuff. And we whooped them, right? 100-hour ground war and all that. But it wasn't so cut and dry and so short and sweet. In fact, a lot of people don't even remember. Your best memory of this may be the movie with Marky Mark and Ice Cube and George Clooney called Three Kings. Did you ever see that? The gold heist in Iraq. And the background of the movie, the setting of the movie, is it's after the war, America occupies southern Iraq, and the Shiites are rising up to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And I believe, as correctly depicted in the movie, George H.W. Bush encourages this on Voice of America Radio, and the U.S. Air Force drops leaflets all over southern Iraq, encouraging the Shiites to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. But then, they betrayed him. The Great Bay of Pigs, the great stab in the back in the desert of the spring of 1991. Because what happened was, the Bush administration realized the Iranians are coming across the border to take over the revolution. The Iraqis who sided with Iran 10 years ago are now coming back. So we just spent 10 years supporting Saddam Hussein to contain the Shiite Iranian revolution. Now we're importing it. Oops. So they choked. And they called off their support for the uprising, and they allowed Saddam Hussein to keep his attack helicopters and his tanks, and they stood back as Saddam Hussein massacred more than 100,000 Iraqi Shiites and Kurds. Then, the whole thing was over. It's not like Saddam Hussein was going to continue killing every last one of them. The insurrection was put down, but this became the excuse for America to stay in Saudi Arabia. Now we have to protect the poor Shiites who we just set up and betrayed. And in order to do that, we have to keep our air bases in Saudi. Now this was the single proximate cause of the turning of Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan's Arab mercenary fighters from the war in Afghanistan of the 1980s into anti-American terrorists. And in fact, they came from so many different countries and had so many different agendas. I want to kill the king of the El Presidente of Egypt. Oh, I want to overthrow the king of Jordan. Well, what was the one thing they could agree on? Attacking the United States of America. And it was bin Laden and his partner Ayman al-Zawahiri, who came from Egyptian Islamic Jihad, who came together on the premise of attacking the United States. Now, during the entire 1990s, when they started, remember, Bill Clinton had been in power 1 month and 1 week before the first World Trade Center bombing, the end of February 1993. And after that, they continued to attack. They bombed a Radisson Hotel in Yemen, attempting to kill Americans in 1992. They attacked the Americans training the Saudi National Guard in 1995. They attacked the Khobar Towers in 1996, which Bill Clinton and the Saudis blamed on Iran across the Gulf, which was a lie. It was bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed who did it. And they did, of course, the famous Africa embassy attacks in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Nairobi, Kenya in 1998. And the USS Cole attack in the year 2000. The whole time making it clear what deadly enemies they are of the United States and how desperately they would like to inflict massive casualty attacks on this country. But you know what Bill Clinton did? He kept supporting them the whole time anyway. He took their side in Bosnia, which is where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the ringleader of the September 11th attack, earned his stripes as a Mujahideen leader, fighting with American backing against the Serbs in Bosnia in 1994 and 95. He also took the side of the bin Laden-tied Kosovo Liberation Army in the Kosovo War of 1999, again against the Serbs, breaking off the Albanian-dominated province of Kosovo there in league with the Kosovo Liberation Army, who thankfully turned out to be more heroin dealers and gangsters and criminals and organ thieves than suicide bombing, head chopping bin Ladenite terrorists at the end of the day. So we got a lucky break there. And Bill Clinton also supported the Mujahideen and the bin Ladenite Mujahideen, the Afghan war veterans of the 1980s, fighting against Russia in Chechnya in 1999 and 2000. And that sounds like conspiracy crankery, but it's not. And I've got 2 or 3 sources in the book in front of me here, and I got 4 more in my next book coming out on that very same subject. One of the head investigators for the Senate Intelligence Committee wrote a giant report about it and everything. In fact, funny anecdote, sorry, this is trying on my time. I thought it was the Stratford dump at WikiLeaks. And I said that on my show or in an interview, and someone confronted me on Twitter. Well, I looked all over WikiLeaks, and I can't find it in the Stratford leak anywhere. And I was like, oh no, did I get that wrong? And I looked and I looked and I looked, and I couldn't find it either. And then finally, I deleted WikiLeaks for my search. There it is, right on the Stratford website, right on the front page. You can read it yourself. You didn't even need Julian Assange to bring it to you. You can look at the public. You don't even need to put it in archive or get around a paywall. It's right there, paywall free on Stratford. A giant, very in-depth report about Bill Clinton's support for the terrorists in Chechnya fighting against Russia in 1999 and 2000. And this is something that Vladimir Putin mentioned in his declaration of war in late February of this year. He said, you think we've forgotten that? The American people certainly have, but they have not. All right, now, the whole time that Bill Clinton's supporting these guys, as I said, they're attacking us. But they're not just attacking us because they're angry children throwing a temper tantrum. They have a strategy. And the strategy was not to make us run in cowardly terror and go home and hide, which is what every member of the war party wanted us to believe 21 years ago. But that was not true, and a lot of people knew better at the time. But here it is, from as close as from the horse's mouth as you could get. The year's 2010. Osama bin Laden is still alive, hiding under Pakistani intelligence protection in Abbottabad. And Rolling Stone magazine interviews his son, Omar. Now, this is not his son who was the terrorist who the Trump administration reportedly killed a few years ago, Hamza. This is his son, Omar, who was with bin Laden in Afghanistan up through the summer of 2001. And said, I'm out of here, and left before September 11th, and the war began. He told Guy Lawson, my father's dream was to bring the Americans to Afghanistan. He would do the same thing he did to the Russians. I was surprised the American took the bait. I respected the mentality of President Clinton. He was the one who was smart. When my father attacked his places, he sent a few cruise missiles to my father's training camp. He didn't get my father, but after all the war in Afghanistan, they still don't have my father. They have spent hundreds of billions. Better for America to keep that money for its economy. In Clinton's time, America was very smart, not like a bull that runs after the red scarf. I was in Afghanistan when Bush was elected. My father was so happy. This is the kind of president he needs. One who will attack and spend money and break the country. I'm sure my father wanted McCain more than Obama in the 2008 election. McCain has the same mentality as Bush. Now, obviously he's quite naive about Bill Clinton and Barack Obama here, but that's not the point. The point is he's saying the worse we go after them, the better it is for them. That's all they ever wanted. Bin Laden didn't think he was going to live to be the king of the Sultanate. You know? He was trying to get us to destroy ourselves. Al-Qaeda at the time of September 11, 21 years ago, was no more than 400 men hiding in the Nangarhar province in eastern Afghanistan. A small group of bandits, right? A crime ring. Essentially civilians, like they're mujahideen fighters, but they're nobody's soldier. They're, as Donald Trump would say, losers. They're nobody. And our government quite deliberately pretended to believe that somewhere out there is this caliphate and it's coming for us. And these not even 2 dozen men who had to steal our airplanes to even have a weapon to attack us with, they are the vanguard of the Caliphate Empire. And I'm sure you've all heard the comparison ever since then, and ever since, not just back then, but ever since then, to Pearl Harbor. It's pretty directly comparable, right? 3,000 dead, surprise attack first thing in the morning, now we're at war and all these things. But there was an empire of Japan. There was no caliphate. It was just bin Laden and his few hundred lackeys hiding in no man's land in the middle of nowhere on the Durand line between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And from the very beginning, they deliberately lied to you. They knew that day, because they knew all summer before it happened, that it was Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda who had done that attack. But in Bush's first statements, he didn't even mention Al-Qaeda, not until Congress. In all of his first statements from the White House, he talked only about terror. We're going after terror and terrorism. And we're going to eliminate evil, and we're going to eliminate fear. And by the way, he and all of the war party on TV and in government said, the Taliban is Al-Qaeda, and the Al-Qaeda is the Taliban, and they're the very same thing, and we're taking the fight to the guys that hit us. But the truth is, as I demonstrate, I think quite convincingly, you tell me, in both books, but especially the later one where I have even more sources, Bush deliberately decided to let Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri escape from Tora Bora in December of 2001. I won't go through the whole case here, but essentially the CIA Special Activities Division paramilitaries and the Delta Force on the ground were begging, literally begging, directly to the President of the United States for Rangers and Green Berets, who they absolutely had enough of, and including James Mattis had 4,000 marching Marines who all could have come to help seal the border between the Nangarhar province and Pakistan, and Bush refused to do it no matter what. Called off the airstrikes on December the 8th. They didn't get away till the 17th. And the guys in the CIA and the Delta Force on the scene would say things very coy like, we just couldn't understand why they wouldn't give us the reinforcements. And, you know, if you read the CIA officer's book, Gary Bernson, right after he says that, it's all redacted and blacked out. They won't let him tell the rest of the story. And then from there, what they do? They conflated this group of a few hundred bandits with the government of Afghanistan that had actually tried to warn us of the attack and didn't do it, and created a regime change in Kabul, and immediately started building up the narrative to go to Iraq. Now, of all the different reasons to go to Iraq, the most important one was they thought it was strategically smart. They were going to exploit your family's fear of terrorism. They're going to call anybody who knew better a traitor to this country. And they're going to essentially gin up a war against a nation that had absolutely nothing to do with it. They might as well have attacked Brazil. And General Wesley Clark, who had been terrible during the Kosovo War under Bill Clinton, still convincingly told the story that when he went to the Pentagon in fall or just, maybe late 2002, a lieutenant general, I believe it was, called him into his office and said, "General, you need to look at this." And it was a paper that said these are the countries that we are going to regime change. 7 countries in 5 years. This is after Afghanistan. Next, we're going to Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and capping it off with Iran. And Wesley Clark says that he said, "Why?" And the general said to him, "I don't know." When the fact of the matter is, none of those nations had the slightest thing to do with the attack on our country in any way whatsoever, nor any operational or helpful relationship with Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda. It was just a pretext. And for all the 9/11 truthers who believe that Dick Cheney and his allies did the attack themselves, I don't blame you, because they might as well have. The reality is, the cynicism with which they exploited that tragedy makes them as guilty as the perpetrators. Just like the cops who hid outside in Uvalde while one young man committed that massacre. They share absolutely in that. And then, now here's an important point, and it's a little bit difficult, but it's worth it, and you can read about it later and catch up. But you remember I said the motive, the reason that Bush Sr. betrayed the Shiite revolution in Iraq was because it was too close to Iran. And that was where he left it in 1991. Well, that was where W. Bush picked it up in 2003. And he essentially took the Iranian Shiite revolution all the way to Baghdad. Now, according to the neoconservative war party, this was going to be great because they're going to do whatever we say. And they're going to help separate Hezbollah from Iran, and a whole laundry list of great results are going to flow from this. But that was stupid and wrong. As stupid and wrong as the war itself. And so what they ended up doing was putting Iran's best friends in power in Baghdad, which is exactly what they did not want to do. And so by 2006, not Barack Obama in 2009, by 2006, George W. Bush turned his policy around. They called it the redirection. And they said, now that we've done so much to empower our regional adversaries, the Shiite Iranians, now we have to do everything we can to tilt back toward the Sunni Arab kings of Arabia. But they don't have armies. They just have bin Ladenite head chopper, suicide bomber, shock troops is what they've got. And so when George Bush launched the redirection, just 5 years after September 11th, even while Americans are still fighting Al-Qaeda in Iraq, he's committing treason. And he is backing bin Ladenite fighters in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Iran. Fatah al-Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the worst of all in Iran, Jandala. Suicide bomber, head chopper crazies, guys who could have got us into a war, murdering army officers and things like that. And so a lot of people wonder, didn't you wonder in 2011, 12, 13 through 16, why is Barack Obama backing Al-Qaeda in Syria? Seems like that would be contrary to American interests. And it wasn't like it was a conspiracy theory. It was on TV every day. They were bragging about it. The only criticism was, why isn't he doing more? Well, the answer was not that Barack Obama was a secret Muslim terrorist from Kenya with loyalty to America's enemies. Is that he's essentially a secret George W. Bush Republican. He's a centrist, not a radical. And he was inheriting and implementing the exact same policy that he inherited from W. Bush. You could call it oops, the redirection. We put Iran's best friends in power in Baghdad. We can't fix that. But what we can do is we can try to get a consolation prize by, for example, overthrowing their friend Bashar al-Assad in Damascus. So that's going to be our plan C. And after backing the Al-Qaeda forces in Libya, they went on to Syria. And that war, as you all remember good and well, led to the rise of the actual caliphate that had been nothing but Sean Hannity's fever dream of ridiculous propaganda from 2002 and 3 and 4. And Barack Obama literally made it come true for them. You know, W. Bush gave them Western Iraq, then Barack Obama gave them Eastern Syria, but he also gave them billions of dollars worth of weapons and equipment and supplies and everything they needed to invade and conquer Western Iraq, which then led to, as you'll recall, Iraq War III from 2014 through the end of 2017, Donald Trump's first year in power, which they fought to destroy the caliphate that they had built to spite the Shiites who they were mad at because they had already fought one war for them, and now two. So, it's not just a horrible war on terrorism that's killed 2 million people, that's cost $10 trillion, 30,000 soldier suicides. It's a war for terrorism that we've been fighting really most of the time. If you want to look at it in the scheme of things, America's been backing bin Ladenite type Mujahideen fighters from 1979 all the way through today. The only time they took a small break was for 3-4 years after September 11th. And then even while we still had guys in Iraq fighting against Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Barack Obama was backing them on the Syrian side of the line. Right back to supporting them. Again, Bush supporting them in Lebanon and in Iran as early as 2006. The worst one of those is in Yemen. And I swear to you, I'm going somewhere with this. In 2009, Barack Obama came in and said, look, I'm not sending a massive 3rd Infantry Division into another country like Iraq, although he massively escalated the war in Afghanistan, where there were no Al-Qaeda, and he knew it. He said, where there are Al-Qaeda, I want to fight them. So he told the CIA to target Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, guys who had bombed the USS Cole, who had helped to coordinate the September 11th attack, who short time later tried to blow up a plane over Detroit on Christmas Day 2009. You might hear, oh, Al-Qaeda linked fighters. These guys are real Al-Qaeda guys, AQAP. And there were what was left of old Al-Qaeda hiding in Pakistan. Barack Obama unleashed the CIA drone war against them. That war lasted from 2009 until 2015 in Yemen. And I'll skip the politics of how it all backfired. But by the end of 2014, the beginning of 2015, a new regime had taken power in the capital city to a great degree as a consequence of Barack Obama's war on terrorism. And when they did, our current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, initially backed them. They're called the Houthis. They're a group of Shiites from the north of Yemen. And to Al-Qaeda, the only good Shiite is a dead Shiite. So our current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, who was then the 4-star general, commander of Central Command, made a deal with the Houthis. And according to the Wall Street Journal and Al Monitor, in both extensive reports from January 2015, he was passing intelligence to the Houthis to use to kill Al-Qaeda. Just 2 months later, Barack Obama stabbed the Houthis in the back, Lloyd Austin with him, although it was apparently, reportedly over his dead body, but he went along anyway. And they stabbed the Houthis in the back, and they took Al-Qaeda's side. Just as Bush had earlier with the redirection, and as Obama had done in Syria, he put the United States of America again on the side of Al-Qaeda. Because the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates did not want this Shiite Houthi regime to rule from the capital of Sana'a. And they were determined to launch this war. Now, this is no scoop. This was Barack Obama's own people told the New York Times. We did this even though we knew the war would be long, bloody, and indecisive. Get it? They have no idea what victory is even supposed to look like. But they know a lot of people are going to be torn to shreds. Even though the war is going to be long, bloody, and indecisive, we have to do this to placate the Saudis. Not to protect Americans' lives or liberty, or even our national interest as broadly defined as you could define it, but to placate the Saudis. Their brand new Deputy Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Bonesaw, had just taken power and was trying to make a name for himself inside the royal family. 29 years old, Deputy Crown Prince, brand new defense minister, said, I got to start a war. And guess what? It worked. He did move up. And because he was a leader at war, he was able to use that political power and capital inside the royal family to arrest all of his rivals and enemies, seize all their money, and declare him, and arrest even his cousin, and declare himself crown prince. And that was why they started the war, for this guy's own selfish interest, essentially. They called it Operation Decisive Storm. That was 7 years ago. In the meantime, this war has quite literally been treason in support of Al-Qaeda and genocide. As even through all of our wars, our government, well, 1991 is different, but through all the terror wars, we didn't target the civilian infrastructure and really try to destroy the sewage and the electricity and the waterworks and things. But that's what the Saudis have done. It's sort of like a lynch mob, the diffusion of responsibility. They're flying our planes, they're dropping our bombs, but it's they that are doing those things. So they can violate all the Geneva Conventions, they can violate all of our laws of war, they can wage the war however they want, we'll still help them do it, and any fault is on them, not us. And so they have been deliberately from the beginning targeting the civilian infrastructure of the country of Yemen. The electricity, the waterworks, the sewage, the garbage men, all the garbage trucks and whatever, any trucks that you have in the country, factories of any kind, marketplaces, any kind of auto dealership or anything, and with a special focus on the farms, on the very basis of life. They target the grain silos, the flocks of sheep in the fields, the horses in their stables, all the irrigation ditches. They sink the fishermen's boats. They're doing everything they can for 7 years straight to reduce this already poorest country in the Middle East to absolute destruction. And it's worked. Even the official numbers are that 500,000 civilians have already been killed in this war. And I guarantee you we're going to find out that it's a hell of a lot more than that. And when we have our troops on the ground there at Special Operations Forces doing one hit here and one hit there, but you have to understand this war is every bad as Iraq War II, and it's every bit as much America's responsibility as Iraq War II. They asked Barack Obama for permission to launch it. They got his permission and they kept it, and that of the Trump administration and the Biden administration too, all the way through. But now here's the real point. There's a ceasefire now. We're in the 5th month now of a 2-month ceasefire. And it's not perfect and there have been violations, but overall it's holding. It's the most effective one that they've had so far. And get this, the War Powers Resolution that a previous speaker mentioned today has been introduced in the House and the Senate. We have active War Powers resolutions. World historical event right now in the House and the Senate. There's something like 100 progressive, left-wing, and religious groups joined by at least a solid dozen libertarian and conservative groups, including the National Libertarian Party, Young Americans for Liberty, Bring Our Troops Home.us, Concerned Veterans of America, and many more, working together. If somebody tells you, call your congressman, son, what use is advice like that? But when we're all doing it together, it really can make a difference. And we have a campaign now. So everyone, call their Congress, write, email, send faxes, especially pieces of paper piling up in their offices, especially if you have a group of any kind, whether it's a political group or not. Your, little old lady sewing bee. If you can promise to turn out or withhold 15 votes when you make your case, it's better than nothing. And if we're all doing that, tens of thousands of us across the country contacting the House and the Senate, and we just will give them no rest, and that regardless of what TV says about January 6th or whatever is their preoccupation, if we force the issue and make Yemen the issue of this fall and of politics, of re-election campaigns in November, we can force this war powers resolution through. And we did it before in 2019, and unfortunately Trump vetoed it. But we can do it again. It'll be much harder for Biden to veto. And it is a slippery slope argument, y'all. I understand it. It's not perfect. But if we can really work together, I believe we can pass this resolution. And if we pass this resolution, it truly could be the key to ending this most horrible war in Yemen. It literally is genocide and treason. And all you have to do is go to 833stopwar.com. And they have their bullet points of the most important information for you. And then they have the phone number, 833-STOP-WAR. It'll connect you directly to your congressman, directly to your senators, and there's even a script there. If your congressman's a Republican, tell him this. If your congressman is a Democrat, tell him that, and how to form it. And we're all doing this together. We got the Young Americans for Liberty and the Libertarian Party and all these groups. And I like to think that we're going to be able to double the numbers of calls that the left are able to turn out on this. There is no Yemen lobby in America. There is no champion of this cause on TV news. There's just peace groups. There's just us. And we have to do the right thing to end this war. And now, can I get one more minute on Defend the Guard, or I gotta go? All right, now let me tell you real quickly about Defend the Guard.
Nobody's going to move the governor when he gets up here.
Oh, is he? Yeah, that's fine. We'll let him go. Last night on the Tim Pool show, the great Dave Smith said the empire is the enemy of the republic. But you know what? The reverse is also true. The republic is the enemy of the empire. By that I mean the Constitution. By that I mean the old law that still somewhat rules this country. And we can invoke it. We can pass Defend the Guard legislation across this country. Use the state governments to nullify federal policy, to interpose themselves between their citizens and the national government, exactly as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison themselves recommended in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And we can use what's left of the forms of our old republic to force an end to this world empire. And let me tell you, when Dan McKnight first picked up the cause that Pat McGeehan had begun in the West Virginia House back years ago to push this Defend the Guard legislation, and he started being joined by combat veterans, not from Vietnam, not long-haired hippies from long ago, but combat veterans of the terror wars, especially Iraq and Afghanistan. And they started making noise and getting this introduced in state houses. Our government panicked. And every time that the guys from defendtheguard.us would show up at these state house and state senate hearings and meetings, the Pentagon would send a 2-star general to rebut them and refute them and to threaten to withhold federal money, if you think about it. They're very worried. And I don't know how worried they are that a governor would sign a law like this. They're terrified that we're even talking about it. And they're terrified that we're not long-haired, old hippie veterans of the Vietnam War, but that this movement, and to be perfectly clear, I'm not talking about myself, but that this movement is being led by combat veterans of this generation who are trying to spare their younger brothers and their sons what they've gone through for no good reason. The NewsHour on PBS came and did a 20-minute special all about them. You know, they've got this legislation introduced already in 30 states out of 50. And what this does, just like with the Yemen campaign, what this does is it gives us a chance to set the agenda, to set the political conversation in America. We don't want to talk about that. We want to talk about this, and in a way that they can't ignore it. And for, especially veterans and combat veterans here today and watching online, considering this, look up these guys. You want to have a voice? Let me tell you something. I've been told for the last 20 years that since I'm not a veteran, I gotta shut up in deference to the feelings of the guys over there fighting. The only people who are allowed to talk about this stuff is the veterans. All right? Well, how about we take them up on that and we put these veterans up front? And I told Dan McKnight, the leader of BringOurTroopsHome.us and DefendTheGuard.us, that you might as well have just had Ross Perot's grandson deposit $1 billion in your bank account. That when American combat veterans get up and say that now's my turn to speak about this, people listen. They have to. And as you heard today, what they have to say is absolutely powerful and moving. And that's why our government is so terrified about this movement. And that's all the more reason for us to be reassured that this is the right thing to do. To use the Constitution in the best way we can from the bottom up to nullify and interpose the American empire to save our old republic. Thank you.